So now that the audience knows your name and knows your very illustrious resume, we feel like you're experts. Short of that, the court sees you as an expert by taking testimony as word of the industry. So really, there should not be anyone in the industry worth their salt who at this point can throw stones at you, your credibility, or your ideas. Let's talk about some of those ideas. What's on your mind? What's the first topic you want to address and attack so that we can kind of banty it around? And now we can call you Tony.
Great. Yeah, that's another welcome change. Some of this exposure is not. I would say most of it is not something that concerns me at all. I have nothing to hide, and it makes things easier in many ways, as you suggest. So we touched on the last time I was on your podcast, on Rail Talk, we touched on Mare Caps and maybe more than touched on them, but I wanted to dip in again, at least briefly, because I crunched a few numbers and I think that they help to illustrate what I consider being an important point. Based on many sources, not least of which was the large genetic study that we discussed in the previous podcast, there is clearly evidence of a worrying degree of concentration of bloodlines in thoroughbreds worldwide. And, quite possibly it's even more extreme in the US, though I'm not certain of that. And given the shocking degradation of durability over the past 50 years, we've talked about that too. Average number of career starts around 1970 or 72 or 4 was 30 or more, and now it's half that number. This issue is not merely about the much more general unknown tipping point that was referenced in that study, because we've been observing associated problems, including not just durability, but also stamina, which there are obvious explanations for. We see less stamina in the American thoroughbred today than we did, significantly, really, than we did 50 years ago. Now, as to what the, quote, correct number of any proposed Mare Cap may be, even if there were one, it seems to me on reflection that a simple cap would, at least to some extent, be something of a blunt instrument. I think, John, you went down those lines the last time we spoke. And I say that because if all foals are genetically mapped, certainly the technology is available, a much more targeted approach could be employed, and perhaps caps could be fluid in nature. So, for example, when the presence of a particular sire line were to reach some sort of agreed upon danger zone of saturation, a related cap could be employed on sires that were passing on those genes, and then reassessed every few years. I don't know, 3 years, 5 years, whatever the case may be. I don't know how realistic it is to be able to do that, but it seems to me to maybe be something that ultimately would be more practical than the blunt instrument of a simple cap that would also impact stallions potentially that were not themselves adding to the problem of this concentration of genetic material. From a practicality standpoint, while I do have that optimism that cutting edge genetics might be able to help to tailor a thoughtful approach to the problem, I wonder about practicality in a more obvious vein. So let's take a look at the stallions that stand at one farm, which cover a minimum of 200 or produce, a minimum of 200 foals last year in 2023. And I'm talking about Ashford, Coolmore, same thing. So there were 6 stallions at Ashford/Coolmore last year that produced 200 or more foals. And Justify was changed recently to a private fee, but his recent and last published fee was $200,000. So I'm using that to make these simple calculations. So based on a hypothetical 200 Mare cap, which, oh, by the way, is not a particularly aggressive cap, I think it could be argued. This is the amount of gross income that Coolmore and its partners in those 6 stallions would lose, presumably, if such a cap were to be placed on them. Justify $4.4 million. Golden Pal $2.325 million. Epicenter $2.48 million. Practical Joke $3.38 million. Jack Christopher $1.88 million, and Uncle Mo $5.1 million. So the aggregate amount is $19,565,000 in stud fees that would be lost if based on last year's numbers, if there were a cap of 200 on those stallions. So that leads to the obvious question, given John Magner's immense wealth and power in the industry and how he amassed both, is it realistic or even remotely realistic to think that he would give up $20 million without somehow being compelled to do so? That's a big part of what my skepticism is based on. This has nothing to do with Mike Rapoli. Mike has suggested that he himself would be willing to consider, these kind of caps and take a personal hit. Now, he has some other ideas of how the losses might be offset. We can talk about those at some point. But I just think that it does not seem realistic. Yes, I'm using John Magner, who may be or is the most powerful example that I can use. But why would the owner of Spendthrift? I mean, we could do the same thing with any stud farm that has multiple stallions that fall into this category. Why would they choose to do it? Because you tell them, well, look, it's better for the game if we reduce the number. I'm skeptical that that's going to happen. And one final point before you guys give me your views on this, which I'm looking forward to. We did touch this in our previous podcast, but I think it's worth mentioning again. A high percentage of unproven stallions are being bred to high numbers of mares. Of the 26 stallions that were bred to 180 or more mares last year in the U.S., 19 or 73% were effectively first crop stallions. There was no meaningful information available about their runners when they were booked, and that strikes me again as being a very dubious way to attempt to refine the breed in a positive direction.
Now, those are all excellent points, and that's one of the reasons why we enjoy having these conversations with you, because you're well versed in the numbers and you're basing your arguments on fact. And Tony, there's a couple of things that I know when I was asked to be an expert witness on this situation that we also brought up to light. One was exactly what you said, where you calculate how much each individual farm is going to lose, but there's other parties involved that people forget. Number one, a lot of these stallions are syndicated. So it's not just John Magner that has to make the decision. It's the shareholders in each individual stallion that have to be involved. And not so much on Coolmore, but certainly on Spendthrift. Those stallions are cut up into 40, 50 shares, and you have to get at least half of that group on board to say, yeah, we're going to give away some potential income in this small window of time that we have. Because as you mentioned, the new stallions are the ones that are, make up the majority of horses that are standing for or breeding to more than 200 mares. Well, they only have a window of 2 years to do that, because after the second year, all of a sudden numbers start flying in. Their foals get sold. You get an average and a median of what those foals are being sold. There's anecdotal information out there. Do I like the foal? Do I not like the foal? So their window is really small for those new stallions, and they're not going to give up the money initially for the quote unquote good of the industry. And then let's not forget about the Commonwealth of Kentucky that also earns sales tax on stud fees. You think that they're going to want to, give up all this money because in the short run, in the long run, maybe 50 years, 100 years down the road, things might be better for the stallions. I really, I'm usually Pollyanna, and I just don't think that makes sense from a lot of different parties. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll throw it over to Joe, is that when we did the analysis of back then, this was a few years ago, the top 2 stallions in the country that had already proven themselves, it was Uncle Mo and Into Mischief. And I know you can't do this genetically because they're both stallions, but let's just hypothetically say that you were able to breed Uncle Mo to Into Mischief. Did you know that they only have a 4% overlap? 4% of their genetics overlap in the first 6 generations. So the 2 pillars of the industry at that time, a few years ago, Uncle Mo through Indian Charlie and Into Mischief, who were being bred to the most number of mares possible, are from 2 very different lines within our genetic pool. Joe, throw it to you.
Oh, listen, this isn't my area of expertise, so I mostly leave it to you guys on this, but it's interesting. It feels like we're getting constricted on both ends because of the shrinking foal crop and also the shrinking gene pool. Like it seems like these 2 ends are going to meet eventually, and we're not going to have pretty much any diversity in the game in the breeding aspect. I wonder sometimes if there's a little too much focus on when stallions go to the stallion shed for their first season. Oh, who's he buy? Is he buy the right stallion? Is he buy Tappet? Is he buy Into Mischief? Is he buy Uncle Mo? As opposed to just finding the best runners on the racetrack and then breeding them. And then the same thing I'm sure goes for the mares at the breeding stock sales. Like the value of having an Into Mischief mare is so much bigger than having an Escantrea mare or whatever it is. And obviously when we had a lot more horses on the ground, a lot more diversity, that kind of made sense. But now it just seems like there needs to be a decrease in the concentration on the immediate family, at least. Like maybe, the horse isn't by a fashionable stallion, but has like a great female family down the line. Like it's just, there's a lot of like very short-sighted mating decisions I feel like are being made. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but where you're just looking at who the sire is, who the damn sire is, go. And it just seems like there needs to be a little bit of a step back from that. But like Tony's saying, like this is the kind of stuff that you have to compel people to do. They're just not going to do it voluntarily.